Welcome to the Daily Puzzle, and a big shout out to Seth WMD. Thank you for sharing this awesome daily puzzle idea. Well, there's a lot to dissect here, so let's hit the ground running. First of all, material count. We're down 2 pieces, right? White has 2 extra minor pieces. Although we can think about visiting Forktown immediately, and it is a forcing move, I'm immediately skeptical. We're down a lot of material, and after, say, King D2, notice the bishop is actually guarding the rook. So there's actually 3 pieces defending. So if we take that rook, let's say the knight captures, it feels okay. We might even throw in a rook f2 for a moment. But after bishop e2, we quickly realize running out of forcing moves momentum, and this just isn't really working out in our favor. White currently has 2 extra minor pieces versus our extra rook. Not exactly anything to write home about. So going back, good to think about the forking idea, knight g3, but we're down material and the king is rather exposed. So we're probably going to try to figure out how to attack the king. Now, queen h5 is a possibility, but do we have a clear follow-up, right? Is there any exact reason we're playing queen h5? Not so sure I see any clear follow-up. If anything, white could even play knight g4 just to block the check. And although we can visit Forktown, similar story, king d2, and the bishop is guarding the rook. Again, I'm kind of running out of ideas. I don't really see anything. So going back, one thing I want to look at is something a little more direct, something a little more forcing. And I don't want to see the king just kind of shuffle over to d2 and just say, okay, everything's fine. I want to look for a move that's going to make the king uncomfortable. And I'm noticing we have 1, we have 2, we have 3 pieces ready to have a party on f2. And our first move in the puzzle solution is the thunderous rook f2. Now, this greatly simplifies our calculation task because the rook is probably going to capture our rook. And if we look at the alternatives, we can basically reject them fairly quickly. Like, for example, the king wanting to voluntarily have some kind of staring contest with our queen, probably not the best idea here. Discovering the check, the rook can block, and then it's lights out. So king e1, don't have to think about it too much. The king could also move to d3. That looks highly unlikely to work in white's favor. We already have quite a nice little king box here. Now here we have a lot going on because there's a number of knight moves that can attack the king. We can look at knight e5. That's kind of the most direct idea, and that would force king takes d4. Well, we'll have a bit more to talk about regarding this theme later, but if we're trying to make a decision here and saying, okay, well, knight e5 does allow the king to take, and then I have to work out some details. We also want to kind of flip the script and say, okay, what if the other knight decides to attack the king, right? Because knight e5 is nearly mate. It would be mate right here, right now, if not for the fact that that pawn is hanging on d4. Notice the queen has x-ray potential in protecting that pawn. So by flipping the script and saying, okay, before I start calculating knight e5 and all the complications, maybe I can avoid that. How else do I attack the king? Here we can play knight to c5, sacrificing our knight, but more to the point, revealing the queen's defense of that critical pawn. So knight takes knight is forced, and now knight e5 works. Now knight e5 is mate. So that's a good sign for rook f2. Either king move, whether the king moves to e1 and allows the discovered check there, or it embraces its inner center. In either case, we have a nice little checkmating idea in the air. So the main move here is capturing our rook. Our queen jumps into the charge, captures the rook, attacks the king and the knight, which is unprotected. And again, really forcing. Only one move, king to d3. And this is where things get really complicated. When there's a number of knight moves, it really can turn into a nightmare to solve. Now, one thing we have to be careful about is bailing out, trying to capture a knight, and we might be really excited by the forking potential. So if we attack the knight and say, okay, I'm ready to deliver a fork, well, that's all fine and good, but there's a couple of problems. First of all, the bishop is ready to fight back on behalf of the puzzle, and the knight is also hanging. So this isn't working out, and we need to not get distracted by material. The king is in a lot of trouble. We're completely restricting the king from the second rank, and now it's threatening our knight. Now, one exercise I always like to do, we put ourselves under pressure, like, oh, my knight's hanging, I better move it. Give yourself sort of a pass and say, okay, what if I do nothing? What if I allow the puzzle to do what it wants? So if I play a random move like a6, is it really the case that the knight's hanging? Turns out it isn't, because if the king captures the knight, now we have queen f5 mate. So that's kind of a good sign that it's not the end of the world if we lose our knight. And if anything, it'd be kind of nice to encourage our opponent to do that. But again, the puzzle doesn't have to read our script. And again, bishop e6 is a problem, attacking our king, and the knight is hanging. So going back, we understand there might not be an immediate sense of urgency, meaning defending the knight. But on the other hand, give the puzzle just one moment. Give the puzzle a free hand, and our exposed king might become a problem. So we still need to prioritize our most forcing ideas first. We need to attack the king. How do we do it? Well, we have knight e5, we have knight c5. Those are our two main candidate moves here. If knight c5, very forcing, our opponent is forced to capture our knight. And after knight e5, we again put white under a little bit of pressure. If the king is kind enough to move to e4, well, get your checkmate dance ready. We're going to attack the king, force it into the center, and boom, there's mate. But hang on a minute. After I attack the king is not forced to move here. The king can move to d4, and at the end of the day, we only have a draw. We can attack the king, we can repeat moves, and hope that someday the king could move here and allow a checkmate. But truth be told, it's a draw. So going back, we thought about how to attack the king with our knight on e4. Didn't quite work out. On the other hand, what about knight e5? This is where we're going to hit like a really difficult visualization barrier. We attack the king and give up the protection of the pawn. Now, if the king captures, I'm going to draw some arrows here. I'm going to push us to kind of the edge of our visualization horizon, and then we're going to break it down move by move. But I just want to kind of sympathize with trying to solve this puzzle in real time. After knight e5 and the king takes our knight, that does allow us to play queen f5, and therefore the king is forced to move to d4, and then we have knight c6 mate. Notice the queen guards the fifth rank, and it's guarding d3. No escape. Okay, that's a lot of arrows. Let's resurface. I'm talking about knight e5, king takes knight, and we found a nice forcing path that results in a checkmate. On the other hand, after knight e5, king d4 looks rather, difficult. It's not obvious how we're going to continue the attack. But the visualization barrier here is after we play knight e5, forcing the king to d4, because the other line, taking our knight, results in mate, we need to ask, do we have any new attacking moves? And this is where we can easily miss in advance that by moving the knight off of the c6 square, our pawn is ready to jump into the action. And that is the key move that we have to see in advance and visualize those consequences. Hey, it's a Sunday puzzle. We know it's challenging, but the main point is put in your best effort and kind of compare your notes. What did you see during the puzzle examination? And what was the answer? And what would you need to see in the future in order to solve the puzzle if it didn't quite work out the first time around? So here we're feeling the heat. If we give our opponent a single move, things aren't feeling great. But we have the very forcing knight e5. Now, as I mentioned before, if the king captures the knight, we're feeling really good because queen f5 forces the king to d4. And now look at the queen, completely cutting off the king. So the knight just slides back, delivering a rather harmonious mate. So by looking at that forcing path, if the king captures our knight, we're feeling pretty good. The hard part is seeing in advance that the king will likely not allow the quick mate and will march into the center and say, okay, now what? Now, the good news here is if you're playing your own game with the clock ticking, worst case scenario, we have a draw, right? King is unable to capture our knight without allowing mate. It can move back to d3. And so worst case scenario, look at that, we have a repetition. That's at least, assuring to know worst case scenario, we're not losing. We have a bailout option. But hey, it's the daily puzzle. We're trying to solve the puzzle. We're trying to win the game. The king is in the middle. And now that the knight is no longer posted on c6, we have the option of c5. And think about that. If we play c5, we might initially panic being like, hey, both of our knights are hanging. But truth be told, whether the king captures either knight, we can play queen f5 mate. So after c5, The only move we really have to calculate is knight takes pawn, because if the king takes this knight, mate, and if we see what's behind door number 2, well, one good checkmate leads to another. Queen f5, once again, is mate. So that really simplifies our calculation task. The only option is for the knight to capture the pawn. And now we bring home the full point. The only forcing move that really makes any sense here is attacking the king with our knight. The king is forced to move here, and then we have that familiar mate. So we'll bring the daily puzzle home. Knight to c6, forcing the king to capture our own knight there on e4, finding our inner center. The pawn points to f5. The queen jumps to that square, delivering a beautiful mate. So quite a journey, inspiring the king to find its inner center, so to speak, after a detour or two. And I really hope you enjoyed today's daily puzzle. Going through it really quickly again, just wanted to emphasize the complexity of this puzzle. One of the big signs here, 3 pieces working together, ready to have a party on f2. We lead with the rook. By process of elimination, these other moves don't work. The rook captures, we bring in our queen, and we force the king up the board. That's always a bad sign with so many pieces on the board, especially a queen and some knights ready to cause some mayhem. You don't really want your king to be leading the fight here. And we were able to exploit the vulnerability of the king by playing knight e5. And I think the really hard point here was not so much finding this, which is still challenging, seeing that we have a forced path to mate. But I think the really difficult part here is that the knight check is preparing the debut of this pawn. So after king takes, we have that beautiful move, c5. Really nice move. Both of these pieces are now immune from capture thanks to the pawn guarding d4. So it's not just about attacking the king, it's about restricting the squares, preventing access to d4. Therefore, we're kind of narrowing the corridor. The knight is forced to capture, and then we slide back to c6. The pawn has done its thing, attacking the king. The knight comes back. King is forced to capture our knight with queen f5 to follow, because if the king refuses to capture our knight, well, now the knight happily collects its rival, delivering another rather picturesque checkmate. Well, that's it for now. Big shout out once again to Seth WMD. This is National Master Dane Matson, and I'll see you next time.